Hello, I'm Lorenzo Valla, and welcome to History of the English Language Online. Just kidding, it's me, Dr. Newman, and we're going to be talking about early modern English and some of the cultural developments. So let's get into it. As I think we've discussed, by 1485, this 1485 is often given as kind of a threshold for the cutoff of early modern, of medieval period and of Middle English. By 1485, England is already the language of parliament, governmental documents, of print. And print is a really new cutting-edge technology at the time, but people take to it. It had been slow to reach England, and the prestige of the English language had been slow to rise. Between 1460 and 1485, when England was racked by a series of civil wars, of dynastic wars, really, called the Wars of the Roses, over the not like a total civil war, but a succession of coups. It's kind of like what do you call it? That Game of Thrones is sort of based on the Wars of the Roses, except instead of the Starks and the Lannisters, it was the Yorks and the Lancasters. But meanwhile, the London and the civil service continued to develop because they were a prize. They were a means to exercising power. So this war didn't involve either side burning London or killing the civil servants. They wanted to control them. And it was during this time that Caxton set up his printing press in Westminster. And in the following century, there were huge transformations in terms of how texts were used and disseminated in society. And this is basically in the explosion of what we might call print culture. There's a great expansion of printing and pamphlets and news sheets. Paper, which has replaced parchment, gets cheaper and cheaper. In the meantime, this is the first point. This is when English really starts to expand overseas. That happens first in Ireland, right across the Irish Sea. Anglicization intensifies in what had been the Celtic, or what are still the Celtic parts of Britain, really, the British Islands, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. And it's during this period that the first English settlers in Virginia and New England arrive. Some 400,000 English-speaking people have reached North America by, 1650, I'd say? That's a rough estimate. I don't know. The other thing that happens during this time is that there is a huge number of, and here's a fun word, neologisms. Neologisms? I like neologisms. Many, but not all, are what are called Inkhorn terms. Now, some not all words are Inkhorn words. Some are borrowings from neighboring languages. Jump comes into the language at this time, either from Danish or Dutch. There's similar words in both. But Inkhorn words were words that came mostly from Greek and from Latin. And part of this is because this is the period during which the study, it's a period that's sometimes identified with what's called humanism, or the studia humanitatis, the study of human things, of the humanities. And originally this was part of a binary term. The other was the studia divinitatis, the study of divine things. So rather than just studying theology and religious topics, there was an increase in interest and prestige for studying poetry, politics, the liberal arts, all of these things. And there's the revival of this idea of a course of general education preparing young men for active citizenship in the polis. This involved training orators, right? And so they had to learn the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And so during this period, there's this revival of these ancient classical ideas. And correspondingly, there's a rising focus on Latin and Greek texts and language. Some of the original, the beginning of philology in a lot of ways. Because these were considered this great source of culture. And in the West, Western Europe, I should say, in Western Europe, knowledge of Greek was largely lost for a very long time. The access that a lot of medieval philosophers had to Greek thought actually came by way of texts that had been translated into Arabic by Muslim scholars during the Islamic Golden Age, and then translated into Latin, often in activity in Spain, in Iberia, where there Muslims and Christians and Jews all coexisted for a long time. So, what happens in the Renaissance is that there's a rising sense of wanting to recover the original forms and meanings of text. There's an awareness that arises that Latin has changed over time. And Lorenzo Valla was an important figure in that. He, go Google the donation of Constantine to find out an interesting thing that he did, which was upsetting to traditional authority in some ways. He debunked a claim that the Catholic Church made that the Roman Empire had donated all of the its property, basically, and its dominion over the known world to the Pope, but that the Pope had basically loaned it back on a kind of permanent loan, but that ultimately the Christian Church and the Catholic Church had authority over the world. And the document that supposedly was the will from the Emperor of Constantine donating it to the Church, he looked at it and using the early kind of historical linguistics that they had said, there's no way this was written when Constantine was alive. This must have been written at least 500 years afterwards. And so this is part of the independent-mindedness and the attention to historical change that is characteristic of what we call the humanistic period. At the same time, though, that you have this revival of interest in Latin and Greek, you also have this intensification, this process going on in a lot of the countries of Europe, in France, in the German-speaking countries, in Poland, in Italy especially, called vernacularization. The use of Latin becomes more limited because of classicizing reforms. Vernaculars take over, especially in the practical arts like law and medicine, and these are becoming more important. We get new functional varieties which take over discourse domains that had previously belonged to Latin or French. That is, whereas law had been practiced in French in the 14th century, it comes to be practiced in English by the 16th century, although it still will have a lot of French and Latin in it. In fact, modern legal language, for example, still has a lot of French. In the American Supreme Court, when the bailiff comes in and calls everyone to attendance because the justices are coming in, he says, and this is practice that goes back to the House of Lords centuries ago, he says, "Oyez, oyez, oyez," which means listen, right? And that's from French. But more and more of these professions are being practiced in English, and there's writing in English, and that's fueling vernacularization. And that raises the prestige of the language English. Nationalism is another force that elevates the vernacular language. There's a conscious elevation of the national language and national literatures. And you can see this especially in literary production. Edmund Spenser, an older contemporary of Shakespeare's, and one of the greatest poets of the 16th century, he's generally regarded as, consciously wanted to write an English epic, and part of it was to make English a better and more important language. And interestingly, in The Faerie Queene, he often uses archaic, old-fashioned forms that had fallen out of use. He will use Middle English vocabulary that he finds in authors like Chaucer in order to give it the kind of prestige and gravitas of oldness, right? So Spenser, but Tasso is doing this in Italy for the Italian language, and Camões is doing this for Portuguese. He writes an epic poem about Magellan, right? This is Portugal's great age, and of course in various countries, then you get what the Italians refer to as il questione della lingua, which was the debate over what language writers should write in, and what language they should use to conduct culture, science, politics, etc. And this wasn't settled for a long time. In the 19th century in Germany, PhD dissertations were still written in Latin. Latin was still a necessary part of anybody's education for up into the 20th century. It's only in the middle of the 20th century that it stops becoming a compulsory subject at especially schools for the upper class, the middle and upper classes. And Shakespeare, never mind. What happens, though, is that during this period, the vernacular absorbs Greek and Latin terms to enrich its capacity. So the vocabulary of English expands greatly. And so from this period, we get words like ingenious, capacity, mundane, celebrate, extol, dexterity, illustrate, superiority, fertile, contemplate, invigilate. That's, by the way, what we say in Canada for proctor. And instead of proctoring an exam, you invigilate it. Proctor has unpleasantly medical sound to Canadian ears. Pastoral, confidence, compendience, relinquish, frivolous, verbosity. All of these words come from classical languages. And why? Why did they borrow it? Why would we say illustrate when we can just say draw or show or some other good thing? Well, part of it was because people wanted to show off their educations, right? And at the time, it was considered like, why are we using all these pretentious Latin words when English is perfectly good words itself? And so this was what the so-called Inkhorn controversies was about. And they're called Inkhorn Words because they were words that were coined for writing. And this here, by the way, is an example of an inkhorn. An inkhorn was this kind of kit that you could keep your pen and your ink in and carry around with you. So they weren't considered, and this was considered a sort of like item that every scholar was supposed to have. And so it's kind of describing that these are words that scholars and that learned people use to show off their status as learned. And Thomas Wilson writes in 1553, among all other lessons this should first be learned, that we never affect any strange inkhorn terms, but to speak as is commonly received, neither seeking to be over fine, or yet living over careless, using our speech as most men do, and ordering our wits as the fewest have done. Some seek so far for outlandish English that they forget altogether their mother's language. And I dare swear this, if some of their mothers were alive, they were not able to tell what they say, and yet these fine English clerks will say, they speak in their mother tongue, if a man should charge them for counterfeiting the king's English. And this is what a scholar named Thomas Wilson wrote in 1553. But enough of this. English is perfectly good words. We don't need to keep borrowing a Greek and Latin word. But people did. People went on and continued to borrow lots of Greek and Latin words. People who were writing about science, philosophy, religion, and also literary words like William Shakespeare. Not everyone survived. There's a lot of Inkhorn words that went away. But it was a debate about the accessibility of language that still goes on. And the importance of accessibility was especially important for religious scholarship. Thomas Wilson was somebody who debated, who criticized the use of Inkhorn words for, among other reasons, that it made the very important matter of religion and understanding theology harder for the average believer to read. And so, in a sense, it was this was also a humanistic view that wanted to bring learning to more people and to critique the old-fashioned kind of very rarefied philosophical, authoritative kind of use of religious thinking and discourse. So it was a debate, over accessibility, so to speak. One important thing to remember, though, is that this debate was happening among the top, 5-10% of society. It was not the vast majority of English people were illiterate in the 16th century. And now it's important to remember that literacy is not binary. It's not either you're literate or you're illiterate. There were a lot of people who had various kinds of functional literacy, where they can read a bill of goods from a grocer, or they could read a deed for a contract. But the Inkhorn Words was debated over by people with what we call advanced literacy, people who could read and write difficult things. And so whenever people are complaining about something, those complaints very rarely win the day, because especially if it's a matter of prestige, reputation. But far more Inkhorn words were coined than survived. A lot of them have dropped out. So we have the word to recapitulate, as in to sort of repeat and sum up, but we no longer have the Greek rooted version. Anencephalize, which anencephaly is actually a medical condition where an infant is born with a little to no, without a complex brain and just a brain stem. Kind of sad, really. Annihilate, to reduce to nothing. We do have annihilate, so we have a different version of it. Sometimes we see that. Instead of obsolete, we have instead of exolete, disused or obsolete. We have that. This one has gone away. We don't use that anymore. We don't use fatigate to tire out. We don't describe something alluring, enticing, or attractive as illicebrus. We never call something that is huge or immense or very great ingent anymore. Just didn't work. That one didn't work out. Nor do we use the word obtestate to bear witness or to call upon as witness. But we do have testify. That stayed, right? So that more or less is the Inkhorn controversy. And my discussion question is: who won? Who was right? Who was wrong? What do you think? So get in the discussion board and think about that. And I just wanted to circle back at the very end. Bonus content. What is rhetoric? Where did it originate and why? If you have more questions about this, go ahead and ask me. But this is attached to to readings that aren't part of this version of the class. So don't worry about these last two slides. I hope this video has been helpful to you. It's been a while since I've recorded new content, and it was fun. So I expect to see more of that, because I think that not all of these slideshows have videos attached to them yet. So there will be some fresh videos coming your way. Enjoy the reading. Please get at me with any questions that you have. And thank you for your hard work in this challenging class.